Hello, my name is Brian Azawa. Today I would like to present a video about a topic that isn't brought up much in circles of everyday conversation. At least if you don't study a bit of science, philosophy, and religion. This video will be exploring a concept called Imago Dei, and see how it affects our understanding and acceptance of climate change. But first, a bit of an introduction. Also know that if you fancy any of the beautiful images that are in this video, you can find the websites that they were retrieved from at the very end. Intrinsic value is the basis from which we prioritize legislative, moral, and personal meaning. If we do not value something, quite simply, nothing will be done about it. For example, were cockroaches to become endangered, it's a very rare prospect, but bear with me, most likely, little or nothing will be done to preserve it under the Endangered Species Act. But when the gray wolf was endangered, there were organizations, interest groups, and politicians charging the way for change. The valuation of things is what prioritizes. What it prioritizes tends to benefit the thing. What it does not tends to lead to neglect. This might seem a little abstract, but we'll delve into the more specific examples shortly. So, what we value varies enormously from group to group, person to person. But how we value, that is where we can generalize. If we can understand how, we can understand what and why we value what we do. When people talk about value, there are two sorts, very basically. Extrinsic and intrinsic value. When comparing the two, many people believe that intrinsic value trumps extrinsic. As an example, two people exist. If one were to value the monetary wealth, they would most likely be different, namely one person would be valued more than the other, because obviously one would be slightly more wealthy than the other. This is extrinsic to the person. Using another basis, academic credentials, for example, one, say a valedictorian, would be worth more than any other student in the school, or at least graduating class. What we value extrinsically appears to be based more on what each individual prefers than the grand sweeping generalization, in addition to allowing more than one extrinsic value to come into play, say wealth and academic credentials, perhaps allowing a well-off salutatorian to outweigh a poor valedictorian. It is because of these difficulties, and the fact that extrinsic value tends to cause inequality among people, that the idea of intrinsic value tends to shine out. There are many theories about intrinsic value, but the dominant one among Christians, an influential group within the United States to say the least, is the concept of Imago Dei. This concept, that all humans are created equally in God's image, has some convenient implications for civil rights. All humans are equal, therefore all humans deserve equal protection under law, and have equal access to happiness or opportunity. You get the idea. Because of this dominant theory among one of the most influential groups in the United States, I'll focus this video on Imago Dei specifically. It should be known that there are other ideas that are appealing. For example, humanists, who endorse the fulfillment of each human being, hedonism, seeking pleasure that would be intrinsically valuable, as well as others. So a couple consequences of Imago Dei. Although it wraps the civil rights issue into a tidy bow, Imago Dei leaves almost every other aspect of valuation to neglect. For example, the claim that man is made in the deity's image does not really dictate how man should treat the environment, animals, or even other people, at least in some regard. In fact, not only does Imago Dei not give moral grounds for how to treat these things, namely for example, treat it well, treat it poorly, burn the hell out of it, whatever you want. It does not even say if these things have any value whatsoever. For example, what value could be given to a tree in the Amazon if a man were special because of his quasi-divine status? If the only thing of value according to Imago Dei is man, then nothing else matters. The obvious counter to this is that the environment, animals, and certain aspects of human affairs, for example a person's preference, do not have intrinsic value, but have extrinsic value. For example, an Imago Deist might claim that the environment is valuable because of its nourishment for man, but this too fails. Each person values different things for different reasons. That's pretty straightforward. Imago Dei is attractive because of its grand sweeping statement, all humans are equal. Bam. Anything else is up to speculation. For example, are the trees in Amazon valuable? And if so, how? A few people believe that they are valuable because they soak up carbon dioxide, and that they are aesthetically pleasing, that they provide habitat for animals. Others may think of them as a resource or a fuel, or even a nuisance to be cut down for farmland, which is more lucrative. This demonstrates a large array of potential valuations of the same object despite a common intrinsic value system. This also allows for more manipulative moral grounding that can be used for any purpose. But there are other consequences that affect real life. With regard to civil rights, Imago Dei, pun intended, is a godsend. It allows each person to be equal inherently, meaning, at least in the abstract, that there should be equal pay for equal work, equal opportunity, and equal social rights, like marriage and education. However, despite this theoretical equality, it usually is not properly exercised. There is a correlation between being religious, usually the data are focused on Christians because they're the most dominant in the United States, and being a climate change denier. This is an extension from Imago Dei and evolution argument. Because Imago Dei prioritizes man over anything else, the claim, whether it is true or not, and it is true, that man is no different from animals and that they follow the same laws, has led to some tension between the two groups, to say the least. According to a poll by Pew Research Center, only a third of Americans believe the truth value of evolution. Victor Stenger also makes a link between the kinds of belief in evolution. He generalizes and says that Christians don't believe in the scientific consensus, but in a quasi-evolution. Namely, they believe not that man is a random occurrence, but that there is a divine will associated with it. In fact, the very idea of man being a happenstance appears to incite some indignation among the group, causing a counter-movement that both denies evolution as well as climate change. It is interesting that climate change is also at the center of this battle, but the subtlety appears to be this: they do not deny that climate is warming, or at least many don't, but the fact that man is causing it, that is the issue. But this is where things kind of get serious. If someone denies evolution, that affects that person's understanding of how the world works. He or she might influence others to deny it, and the damage is somewhat local. However, denying climate change is on a higher level of, well, destruction. Obviously, this image is a bit over the top, potentially, but if you deny climate change, you, 1, might continue down the same path that causes the same damage, 2, might negate any real progress to regulating the damaging effects of climate change, and or 3, will actively kick the planet down the drain that's already being sucked into. In short, it isn't good. There are many kinds of climate change deniers out there, so it's important to hone in on what unifies them. Again, these are gross overgeneralizations, but by taking these examples, I think will prove my point, but hint at what might really be happening out there. So there are the would-be scientists like House Representative from Texas, Smokey Joe Barton, who denies that CO2 is a greenhouse gas because we emit it ourselves, it's naturally occurring, and it's in our sodas. It's perfectly safe, apparently. Fortunately, would-be science can be defeated with science proper, and it is indeed defeated, showing that CO2 is in fact a greenhouse gas. There are the religious literal interpreters and fanatics/extremists like House Representative from Illinois and, to some degree of shock, a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee of the United States House of Representatives, John Shimkus, who has said that global warming will not occur because God had made a pact with Noah that there would be no more global flooding, as implied by climate change. Then there are the interesting tenet holders, for example, the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, which is a particularly vocal and concisely worded organization against climate change and evolution based on religious values. I believe it is worth quoting at length the statement from the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation's An Evangelical Declaration on Global Warming. Yeah, just take a moment, pause the video and whatnot, and let it sink in. What they propose are not merely sections from the Bible, but have this quasi-commonsensical taste to them. They propose notions are arguable and still fulfill their religious need and their want to keep people in the place of preference. Again, from Imago Dei. Their tenets are false, however, but it's the style that's appealing. It should be noted, again, that perhaps this is a more radical approach to climate change denial. However, it isn't singular, which is slightly frightening. Now, all these tenets can be seen as an extension that man is special, that they are Imago Dei. I mean, let's break down this a little bit. They deny climate change. They feel that cheap fossil fuels are vital to human flourishing, any climate change control will harm the economy and human lives, and that climate change policies attack the poor. They deny that evolution and the non-special state of humans, that alternative energy is a viable resource, that CO2 is a pollutant, and that policies are worth it because they allegedly harm the poor. Again, these are what the last little bit I just said is what they deny. So, proclamations like this kind of make scientists groan. But before we're simply dismissing these tenets, let's take a look. They deny climate change. There is ample evidence by renowned scientists like Alan Rollbach, professor of climate science in Rutgers University. If you are indeed uncertain whether climate change is indeed a fact, I would recommend taking a look at his work. There is a claim that fossil fuels are vital to our economy. This could be true, but doesn't say anything about whether or not this is a good thing. Fossil fuels are beloved now because they are cheap and have a lot of energy. But they're only cheap because of massive undertakings on drilling and resource extraction, which is not sustainable. A later point they would make is that fossil fuels are good for the poor, but that is only true while we have it and have it cheap. When we run out, the estimates vary as to how soon, but when it does happen, it will come hard and it will affect the poor, probably the most. In the long term, it harms the poor the most, which violates their final principle, quote, "We deny that such policies, which amount to a regressive tax, comply with the biblical requirement of protecting the poor from harm and oppression," end quote. Another claim is that climate change policies will harm the poor. This might have a hint of truth, but the claim isn't about how we should proceed. For example, this seems like the government issue. If the government could set up incentives or ways to make the quote-unquote green technology more accessible, then there will be no, or at least less, damage to the poor. So again, this isn't inherently attacking climate change or necessarily anything like that. But I mean, these things can be addressed through other venues. What they deny is also pretty interesting. They deny any attack on mankind's special status, or that the world is as fragile as we are told. This comes from Imago Dei. As we progress through this video, it will become more and more clear that this, Imago Dei, is a source that we need to cut from our thought processes. So for now, I'll leave it. They also deny that CO2 is a pollutant. This is blatantly false. CO2, although it is emitted by all respiring organisms, it is indeed a greenhouse gas. Granted, it is not as potent as many others like methane, but the sheer quantity that we produce and emit in the atmosphere, that is what makes it troublesome. So why did I take all this time to shut down these tenets? I don't have a vendetta against the organization per se, but it is the type of group that they are that makes them particularly interesting. One could be atheist and dismiss the pseudoscience and the religious radicals, but these kinds of tenets are more interesting and could, at least some of them, be held up to a rational debate. But where they tend to attack climate change or alternative energy initiatives, an opponent could merely claim that these are good questions and that they should lead to new policies in the government and not necessarily, rage against the actual science. So, what do all these kinds of climate change deniers have in common? The would-be scientists, the fanatics, the tenet holders all hold people in the position of power. That would be untouchable, unaccountable. Again, they have this quasi-divine status, if not straight-up divine status. This stems from Imago Dei. To reverse the effects of religion on climate change denial and acceptance, we'll take some action. Either we abolish religion, a particularly difficult goal to achieve, or we could reinstitute another kind of intrinsic value, one that no longer holds people to be untouchable, and also one that can help protect the environment and spread out, the good aspects of intrinsic value that we would actually like to see in reality. Despite the Pope accepting climate change, there are still many Christian groups that deny it. In fact, this pope appears to have a certain difficulty with the masses in the United States. For example, 47% of Catholics acknowledge that climate change is anthropogenic, according to a Pew Research Center report, with 62% of Catholic Democrats, but only 24% of Catholic Republicans believing in its anthropogeneity. With this much support, why is there such lag in action? Many Catholics believe that climate change is second to other issues, like gay marriage and abortion. These, as you can tell, are human issues. These are, then, potentially an extension of the Imago Dei regime. So, what to do? There appears to be a coming change in opinion regarding accepting climate change, but it might be too gradual to come in time to stave off the worst of the warming. Were we able to replace Imago Dei with a different intrinsic value system, then the religious could keep their religion, but may be able to acknowledge that there are more than just people inhabiting the earth, and that the earth needs a little boost. Here's an alternative intrinsic value system. Again, this is just a prototype, but this kind of idea I think would be useful in the future. So, keeping a theistic flavor in order to make it more, palatable to the religious, let's propose the following ideas. As agents of a deity, God or whatever, human beings have a duty to preserve, conserve, protect, and encourage the makings of the deity. This means that although humans might have a special spot in our eyes in order to preserve its, civil purpose of equality, it also implies that not just human affairs matter. It is the careful management of non-humans as well. So this intrinsic value system has a more theistic, especially a more Christian taste to it than other intrinsic value systems. But there are other intrinsic value systems, some that don't necessarily require a deity. Obviously, these would be a little bit more, I won't say difficult to swallow or to accept, but, well, as an example, one that I find particularly compelling is that there is a correlation between intrinsic value and complexity. Now, as an example of that, for example, the human mind, or the human brain, is probably the most complicated and complex object that mankind knows about. It's a very, cherished, very valuable item. And in general, we tend to value things that are more complex more. For example, again, we value a dog, pet or otherwise, more than a fly. The complexity is just so much more, and complexity allows for other things. Now, in this particular instance, one can generally say that life is more complex than non-life. For example, even a tree or a weed is more complex than a rock. And therefore, life in general is more valuable than non-life. Now, then you can kind of say, well, obviously, then the most complex animals are the most valuable. And this would definitely appease the Imago Deist who say, yeah, man is pretty freaking complex. We have our own moral systems, as far as we know. There's a very select group of organisms that have that. And so that would make them happy, but also it does include other non-human life. For example, probably most people would value, at least to some degree, a dog, especially if it's a pet or a pet, for example, but that's an extrinsic characteristic of it, while being complex at least appears to be an intrinsic value or intrinsic property of these organisms. So this is just another alternative intrinsic value system, that there is a correlation between complexity and intrinsic value. An observant listener would probably recognize that there is in fact no God there, and also there is no soul, no metaphysical entity. And this is going to be a bit too far for this particular video, but again, you could either argue that a God is a lot more complex, or perhaps a soul is more complex, But also, one could argue that they're a lot more simple. Like, for example, there are many theories that the soul is indivisible, therefore it's not able to be divided, able to be categorized, which would make it a very, if not merely a very simple entity, the most simple entity. It is exactly composed of one quote-unquote substance. But anyway, that's a that's a discussion for another day. But there are these other alternative intrinsic value systems that I think can replace the Imago Dei, that still gives man a special place in our hearts. So, some closing remarks. This video is not meant to be a mere attack on religion. There doesn't seem to be like something intrinsically part of religion that makes it incompatible with climate change. I mean, as you saw, there were quite a few, at least in the Catholic group, at least within the Democratic Catholic group, there's a majority of people who believe in climate change, and it's anthropogeneity. So again, this video was never meant to be an attack on religion itself, but merely a very specific aspect of religion that can be changed. And if that is changed, we can see it trickled through the rest of the way people think. So if you have any questions or doubt any of the material that's in this lecture, there are sources at the very end that you can check out. Read them, digest them, argue with them. That's what these kinds of videos are for. So thank you for your time, and hope you enjoyed this video.